and others have joined the crowds along the way. And Jesus wanted to be with them. In Mark 6:34, it says, when Jesus saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began to teach them. And then as the story unfolds, we come to learn that the people are with Jesus for quite some time, so much so that at the end of the day, the disciples try to convince Jesus to send the people away because they're hungry and it would cost too much to feed them. And then the response in verse 37 from Jesus, you give them something to eat. And then after some back and forth between Jesus and the disciples, like how on earth are the disciples going to feed them? Jesus says, what food do you have? And the response is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. This is where I want to move over to John's telling of the story, because in his telling, he points to where the food comes from. John chapter 6, verse 9, Andrew says, here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? As I reflect on that story, I mean, I don't know about you, but I find it hard to imagine that out of 5,000 plus people that day, only one thought about bringing any food with them. Now, we could explain it away and just say, well, God wanted there to be a miracle that day, so that's exactly what happened. One person brought food, and I'm okay with that. But, I wouldn't be surprised if there were a few others who brought some food also. But you know what the issue was? They'd already consumed it themselves. They thought of themselves. They looked to meet their needs. They were oblivious to the people around them. Life was about them, and other people didn't factor into the equation. The thing we see different from the boy, in him, there was a spirit of generosity. It wasn't just about see to myself first. It wasn't just see to my needs. It wasn't how will things impact me, but rather there was an attitude in the boy of how can I make a difference? In the boy, we see generosity. Now let's turn from that passage to the verse from Jeremiah. Again, we catch a glimpse of generosity. Listen to the verse again. The Lord appeared to us in the past, saying, I have loved you with an everlasting love. I've drawn you with unfailing kindness. I can remember the very first time I saw Niagara Falls in person. I found it breathtaking. I'd seen the falls on TV before, and even on TV, they looked impressive. But getting right up close and personal to the actual falls, right at the place where the water was going over the edge, I found that mesmerizing. And the thing that really struck me was the amount of water going over the edge. And it'll probably sound a little bit silly to you to hear this, but one of the things I thought to myself as I watched that volume of water going over was, when's the water going to run out? And it wasn't an environmental or climate change kind of question. It was much more simple than that. It just seemed mind-boggling to watch the volume of water breaching the top of the falls and more water to keep on coming. The volume wasn't decreasing. The water wasn't running out. With such volume, you'd almost think that it's got to run out sometime, and yet the water kept on coming. When I think about the everlasting love of God as spoken through the prophet Jeremiah, I imagine something like Niagara Falls when it comes to the abundance of God's love, continually coming. God's love never lessens, never stops. God keeps pouring God's love upon us. And if you want to come to the environmental question, maybe there will come a time when Niagara Falls isn't as spectacular. But as God said through Jeremiah, God's love is everlasting. There will never be a time when God's love is less spectacular. God continually pours out love upon us. And in that, I really see the generosity of God. And as I think more and more about God's generosity, and as I reflect upon living as an instrument of peace in a world of chaos and crisis today, I believe I'm called to live a life of generosity, that others might come to know the abundance of God's love. Over the past 6 months or so, I've come to a discovery of myself. And what I've learned about myself actually kind of puts some language to something I knew about myself, but I hadn't yet really articulated. And it has to do with the word peace. I'm somebody who likes peace. And when there isn't peace, or there's a chance that there won't be peace, I find myself getting a little bit worked up inside. And I'm not just talking about the great big conflicts. I'm even including things that to many would seem fairly minor. I want to give you an example. I'm sure you purchased things before from stores only to decide afterwards that you don't want them and you want to return them. Sometimes taking things back to the store can be very simple. Sometimes, though, it can feel as though you got to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get the thing to be accepted. Well, I want you to know what I used to do when I wanted to return something. I would go to the mall with my wife. I'd then pass the item to her, give her the receipt, and ask her to go and take it back. Now, it probably sounds a bit childish, but 6 months or so ago, I discovered something about myself that put language to why I did what I did. It was almost as though a penny dropped. And I could say, okay, now I understand why that was my go-to action. Don't know how many of you have done Myers-Briggs inventories, with talk about introvert, extrovert, and indicators with regards to how you perceive things, whether it's through your senses or through intuition. And there are other indicators in there as well. Well, I've never really found Myers-Briggs to be all that helpful in coming to understand myself. But this past year, I found something else that seemed to be more helpful to me. I responded to another kind of inventory called the Enneagram, and through that, people find themselves in any one of 9 different categories, which in essence is kind of to show you what your go-to in terms of how you relate to the world. The category I found myself in at the end of the inventory was one called Peacemaker. Now, that might sound all well and good. I mean, people who work at making peace are people that we certainly need in the world. But as I reflect on it, I think sometimes that category could almost be a misnomer, because I wonder whether it really should be called peace, not peacemaker, but peacekeeper. The reason why I never like taking things back to return to stores and ask Mandy to do it for me was because my go-to way of being is to kind of seek out equilibrium and to avoid things that might lead to conflict, if at all possible. Something I've come to, as I've thought about a lot over the past few months, is that peace isn't about avoidance. Peace isn't about passivity. As we see in the words that are used in our theme for today, the word instrument is linked to the word peace. An instrument of peace is something that helps to bring peace about. I think being an instrument of peace is closely linked to intentionality. Whereas the negative side of me being a number 9 on the Enneagram is that I can let the world happen around me and I can be a passive player in it because I just want there to be equilibrium there. But the positive side is that I can actually play a role in being a peacemaker, simply by living intentionally in the world. And the intentionality that I believe I'm called to be living is the intentionality of living a life of generosity. Recognizing the generosity that God has poured out towards me, soaking in that generosity, and then allowing myself to live intentionally with that generosity in my day-to-day life. Often when we think about others who are generous, the image that comes to our mind is just a person who gives things to others. Whether when you give others presents, you might do so generously. When you make an offering at church, you might do so generously. And certainly those actions do give us glimpses of generosity. But I believe our understanding of generosity has to broaden. I believe we've got to spend time reflecting on what it means in practical terms to live a whole life of generosity. Generosity isn't just about what we give to others. I believe God wants generosity to describe our whole way of being, our whole way of living in the world. Too often in our lives, we go about with an attitude of, how do things affect me? Too often we go about with an attitude of, what do I need? What should I say in order to get my point of view across? And I think other people pick up on that. And that way of being then is perpetuated amongst the people that we connect with. And it doesn't take long before people go about life just thinking about themselves. But when we live lives with intentional generosity, soaking in God's generosity and reflecting that from us, so do others experience that way of being. And it can be healing for the world. Living with intentional generosity means living in such a way that others might experience that generosity. When I'm generous with my words that I use when I'm speaking with others, it has an impact. When I listen to others generously, it provides the opportunity to realize that I'm truly listening to them. So often our go-to when we find somebody who disagrees with us is to kind of go at it, or just to kind of shrink back into ourselves or run away. But I think living a life with an attitude of generosity gives space for others to be in a different space than we are, yet still to be loved by God just the same. It saddens me when I hear of Christians who fight for their rights. It saddens me when I hear of Christians who feel as though they've got to push their agenda. I believe that when we do that, Jesus weeps because we're not being instruments of peace. We're not looking at the abundance of love that God has poured out on us and how he invites us to pour that out on others. The difference that we could have on the world for the sake of Jesus, simply by living generously at all times and all places amongst all people, the difference, it could be amazing. And if we go back to that passage of the feeding of the 5,000, the little boy who practiced generosity, what we see at the end of the story is the overwhelming generosity of God, as 5,000 people were able to eat their fill, and still there were 12 baskets of leftovers afterwards. I believe that God calls us all to be instruments of peace. And instruments never make music by themselves. It takes somebody to make music through those instruments. And it takes intentionality from the person who picks up that instrument and an ongoing practice. And I think that's the same with us. We need to be instruments of God's peace God takes us, he wants to breathe his spirit into us and let that music of generosity flow out of us so the world experiences that peace. We need to be taking it on intentionally. We need to be practicing that generosity daily. And I believe that when we do that, when we open ourselves up to be instruments of God's peace, we open ourselves up to be ones who live generously, God takes what we offer and God abundantly blesses it. So I want to just leave you with some questions to kind of ponder, and can reflect on these after this event's even over, maybe sometime in the week. But how have you been impacted by God's generosity? And how might soaking in that generosity make a difference to the way that you might live in the world? What might generosity look like in tangible terms in your daily living? How might your words become more generous? How might your attitudes towards others become more generous? How might God take what you offer, not so you'll merely be a peacekeeper, but that you might be a peacemaker each day? Amen.